Good day around the world, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this SEOWiSE engagement broadcast event. We kindly ask and encourage you to join us in our conversation in the comments of this event and on Twitter using the hashtag humanxperience at the Social Biz Co. We're listening. Today's event is a discussion about keeping it real, social branding on the semantic web. Leading our conversation today is Alexandra Riecke-Gonzales, the voice of SEOWiSE. We have Kristen Drysdale, who will be moderating the conversation and comments. Our very special guests are Mark Traphagen, Senior Director of Online Marketing for Stone Temple Consulting, and David Amerland, speaker, analyst, and author of the book, Google Semantic Search. And now, your host, Alex Riecke-Gonzales.
All right, and of course, Tigger joined us early, like he always does. But thank you all so much for being here. I am so excited. I'm a little bit nervous, hyped up on caffeine, so ready for this event. So I'm not going to bore you with any other information. All I want you to know is that please, please, please engage. Ask questions, offer comments. I have the awesome Kristen Drysdale here to help me out with that because I'm going to be focusing all of my attention on Mark and David and get what I can out of them for all of you. So a big shout out to Kristen. Thank you so much. And we're just gonna get started. We're just gonna do our deep dive. So my first question is I'm going to start with David, and because his post, the post that we're talking about, was titled "Keeping It Real." So I want to know, David, what exactly does that truly mean? What exactly does keeping it real mean for businesses?
I'm very glad we're starting this way because it frames it very nicely. We've been saying keeping it real in marketing for a long time now without ever really meaning that. And it was nothing more than a catchphrase. And the demarcation point for this came about the time that semantic search came into it, which is 2012. So we've been in it for about 2 years now, and it's no coincidence. Essentially, what we're seeing is that for anything to have any kind of resonance in a market that's really overcrowded right now, is the need for it to be high quality, which means to be reflective as closely as possible of the values, the mission statement, the principles that guide you as a person or as a brand or as a business. And there's not a lot of difference between all these three. So essentially the keeping it real battle cry, because that's what it is really, is for that perception of marketing as a persona which was flung out there in the past and was designed to hit trigger points in the audience, emotional trigger points, and elicit a response, needs to go. People now respond to real people, or at least to very real values. We live in an audience, in a time when the audience is very demanding of what they actually consume by the way of information, by the products they buy. They're driven by trust and reputation, and a sense that the connection they're forming informs also, in turn, their own sense of identity and purpose in the world. And the only way to do all this, of course, is by being as transparent as possible, by being as honest as possible, which in marketing hasn't always been possible. So this is a challenge we live in right now, and this is the framework within which everything happens.
And you brought up so many of those big words, right? And a lot of those words actually end up showing up in Mark's article too. So Mark, I'm wondering, do you have anything to add to that idea of what it means for a business to keep it real?
Well, my article, people would see our articles side by side, David's and mine, and think these guys must have worked together, coordinate this, right? Because they just fit together so well. And we totally didn't. Other than that, David and I have known each other for 2 years now. We've talked a lot enough to know that we operate in a lot of the same wavelengths, a lot of the same areas from a different perspective. But you might look at my article, which was in the Moz blog, as being one possible practical application of the big concept that was in David's. And my main point was that if this is what we need to be doing, if we need to be keeping it real in marketing, and online marketing in particular, in the years to come, one of the primary ways that brands can do that is by making use of real people. And here I mean going beyond, we've been used to this in terms of celebrity marketing. You know, brands like to be associated with a celebrity. But this is now people who are actually in the business, producing the content out of an expert level or out of a very empathetic level to the core of that business and representing it as themselves online so that people get to know them. One of my key points was that people relate easier to people than they do to brands. We are developed that way by evolution, that we just want to be with other people, we want to associate with them, we want to be liked by them, we build relationships with them. And so if you have real people representing your brand, that's one way that you can make those connections with people in the online world that lead to the kind of authenticity and trust that David is talking about.
So that transitions beautifully into the next question that I had, because you both mentioned in this idea of keeping it real, you both mention the human component. You both mention the person involved. So Mark, in your article, you wrote, your brand will most rapidly and successfully gain the social trust of its audience when it is closely associated with powerful personal brands. And I mean, your entire article itself is about the personal brand. So what I wonder, and I'm going to start with Mark this time, where do personas fit into all of this? Why do you encourage putting personal brands in front of a business rather than a persona?
Well, I think by persona here, I'm assuming that you mean kind of a fabricated person or personality. And I've had a lot of pushback from people say, like, why wouldn't we just, invent a person and then we can have multiple people represent or work the content behind that person? And some brands have done that, maybe with a certain degree of success. It's certainly a step in the right direction, perhaps, toward being more personal with your brand, but you can only take it so far. A persona can't really build relationships. As I said to somebody last week, a persona can't show up at a conference to speak. Can't be interviewed on a show like this, for example. This is part of the power. David and I very much understand this, and a lot of you who are interacting with us here understand this incredible power that once people get to see that's a real person behind that content. It's somebody I can actually have a conversation with. It's somebody I can actually ask a question, get an answer, and maybe even meet them someday. That's a very powerful connection, and that's what I'm talking about. So it's not just being personal, but having real people engaging. That's the gospel I'm pushing these days.
So okay, so are we comfortable with the concept of a persona being something different from a personal brand? Are we just getting into semantics, David? I think that's a good point.
David's always in semantics.
That's true, I am. But let's look at this, because Mark made a very important point, and he's right. If we take our articles side by side, he actually creates a very granular picture to the more conceptual one which I created, and this reflects in many ways the ways we operate. I work at a very strategic level with large brands, and I don't do execution. This is entirely up to them. Mark actually sees both sides of this, and he's very much into the detail of it. So it's quite important to listen to the challenges which he mentions. My knee-jerk reaction would be that, hey, we don't need personas anymore because we had them in the past and they didn't really work out very well. They tried to shoehorn everybody into some sort of brand-perceived person, which the company then marketed to. And that created a lot of the disconnect which we experience today. However, Mark made a very important point here that a lot of brands are still marketing at an even greater distance than that. So for them, creating a persona perhaps can be an interim stage which begins to make them comfortable with marketing in a more personal way. And I think that's a win if they approach it in that sense, because let's not forget that companies really want to market in a way that has an appeal to us as consumers, and they really want to connect. And when they don't, it simply reflects the inability of their internal systems to adequately reach out and connect with us. So if a persona, a traditional marketing persona, with all the implications of the artifice and the generalizations that come with it, is the interim phase they need in order to establish the internal routines and the evolutionary process that will bring them closer to us, I think that's a win. So much as I would like to say, hey, we don't need personas anymore. We really need to be people. We need to be personable. We need to get personal values across the web. There is still a need for them, sadly, because a lot of companies are not quite ready to make the huge leap required to get to that personal level.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're both distinguishing that a persona is part of the process of becoming a social brand. Is that, I mean, is that a fair thing to take away from that question?
Yes, I would say from an evolutionary point of view, absolutely. And Mark must experience this firsthand because his company deals with clients who perhaps want to get involved in the social web and they haven't got a clue how to do it. So saying to them, hey, be people and put your people up front, sometimes it takes a huge leap of faith and they're not ready for it.
What David just said is so important because that's exactly what we've seen. When I'm talking about this personal brand representative, as I've come to call it, for a brand, I realize that I'm speaking into the future in many cases. I'm trying to, and David does a lot of this too. Calling our job, we feel like, is calling brands toward what they should be doing, and at the same time realizing that even though we put the big picture up there, like this is where your eventual goal should be, there's going to be steps along the way to that. So I think David just laid that out very well, how that can fit into kind of a halfway house or transitional plan toward overcoming the fear, the objections, all the things that get thrown up about having real people out there representing you.
So okay. So we're cool with personas as a step to personal branding, as a step to being a social brand. But what I'm now curious about is where this fits into brand identity, because David, your article really talked a lot about brand identity. In fact, you said it is only when you come out from behind the facade that you begin to realize the power of the human connection. And what I'm curious about is how complex is this brand identity that you're talking about? Because, I mean, I could say, okay, SEOWiSE's brand identity is that we do engagement broadcasting. Done. That's my brand identity. Can it work like that?
Well, if it was as easy as that, I think it would make Mark's job a lot easier, I suspect. Sadly, it isn't. And I frequently encounter very large and extremely successful companies that have yet to quite define in their own minds what it is that makes them special or unique, and that is endemic across the industry. Like with people, we need to define ourselves in order for us to actually become accomplished at something. We can't really become really successful if we are full of insecurities, are full of uncertainties, if we blow hot one day, cold the other about the same subject. This kind of inconsistency only creates holes in our own sense of personal identity, and eventually they begin to accumulate and become catastrophic, especially when we need them the most. Brands are very much identical in that sense. An identity is always a construct, which is created by many layers, and it's also an evolving thing. It's not really fixed. It has fixed values, perhaps, which are the core of it, but a lot of it is an evolving narrative. And brands need to actually be able to understand that. They need to realize what they need to do in order to evolve within that, and they need to formulate it in the first place. And for a company to actually create its real identity, it needs to realize what it is, why it does things in a certain way, what are its guiding principles, what are the moral lines it will not cross. And the companies that are very good at defining that, and there are a few, are basically the ones which succeed in creating that kind of identity. We've seen examples with the John Lewis partnership in the UK, which is one of the large department stores, Zappos shoes, before it was acquired by Amazon. Now it's part of Amazon, and they are constantly evolving in that process. Google, in many ways, they pulled out of China, a massively lucrative market because they weren't willing to compromise on specifics of privacy and given out to the and censorship given out to the Chinese government. So the moment we see these things, we actually realize that internally there's a moral compass which is very hard set. It's not open to debate, and that becomes part of the guiding principles, which allow you to become who you want to become or who you wish to become in the sort of in the public stage. And the same for persons and brands, and for brands it's probably a lot harder because there's a lot more moving parts involved.
So, okay, you set that up beautifully to go to Mark, because the article really talked about personal branding. So how do these personal brands work within this idea of having a brand identity? I mean, how do the two, sort of become one?
Well, I think that the personal brand can be an amazing vehicle for communicating the brand identity in a very human sort of way. Let me give you a very concrete example of that for myself. Just recently, I was at SMX Social Media in Las Vegas, and one of the people speaking there was the director of marketing for the Denny's restaurants, which is a brand here in America that it's a chain diner that was very popular years ago, but had been a declining brand, really in trouble, closing restaurants all over the place because they had become uncool. And they found a way to turn that around. They found a new message. Part of it was involved their product. They improved their product, but also just a whole new way of communicating that. But for me, I would not have connected with that. If I'd seen that in an ad or something like that, I would have ignored it. But having that personal connection and having him explain to me in person and seeing firsthand his belief in, his passion for the message of what Denny's is America's diner. That's their message now. And what that means, it impacted me. I mean, it changed my attitude toward the brand. So I think that when you bring in a personal representative, and this is why in my article, I champion that. Sure, you can outsource this, or you can hire somebody as an expert to do it. That's again maybe another halfway step, but the best is going to be somebody from within your own brand who knows it inside out, who believes in the message, who knows the message, and then can communicate it in that human relational way. I think that's the power that I'm trying to bring together here.
Okay, I think I got it, and I hope the audience got it. So, I mean, because brand identity is, or any sort of identity, a personal identity too, is a construct, as David mentioned. That means that it does evolve and it does change. So when you have these personal brands that can come in, I mean, they kind of help to develop the brand identity for consumers and potentially for the brand itself, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
I was waiting for Mark to reply, but yes, absolutely. I think Mark nailed it in that respect, and essentially, he also beautifully framed the struggle which goes on with so many businesses. It is very easy, perhaps, from a top-down point of view, to say, "Hey, this is what my business is about, and that's it." And the moment that value is not reflected within the specific value set of every person within the business, you don't stand a snowflake's chance in hell of actually projecting this in a real, transparent, and honest way in social media, because you're going to sound false. In order for that to happen internally, the company must change, and that is a real struggle, because suddenly you're asking a company that has worked in a very specific way for a long, long time, and it's worked for them, to change its internal processes, to build real bridges between its people inside, to foster a culture of real trust and real common values. And that's always difficult when you have people who are there specifically to work rather than to do anything else. So yeah, that's I think that covers so many things that Mark said.
Okay then. I think we're ready to, because we're talking about identity as a construct, I think we're ready to move into the semantic search component of this. So, David, you wrote in your article, semantic search does not only index information, it actually understands it in relative importance to its context. It then goes on to understand the relative importance and context of those who share it. And I just have to say, David, this was I've followed semantic search for a while, but this article was the first one where I was like, oh my God, I get it. I totally get it. So thank you for that. So that leads me to the question of why now? Why are we having a conversation about social business now? And how does it rely on the fact that we are now moving into a semantic web?
Yeah, well, here's the story of the human condition writ large. We all would love to be great at what we do and the best people we possibly can be, and then always circumstances undermine our best intentions. And we respond to the set of circumstances we have in front of us, so we bend the rules a little bit, we give excuses to ourselves. We're not as good as we should be because being bad is justified or necessary, or there's no other option. And it's always been the case. And with semantic search, it basically revolves around a single thing. It revolves around the quality of what you share. And it revolves around it for many reasons, not least because it has specific value, which then crystallizes into the value of the moment when the content surfaces in search in response to a search query. But in order to actually determine the kind of value, you also need to understand what kind of person delivers that value and the effort they put in it in order to assess whether it's real or not. And we come down to basically a cost-benefits analysis. If I'm going to spend, for instance, X number of days or even weeks fashioning an article because it's going to be that detailed, that accurate, that high quality in the writing and the presentation that it resonates with my audience, then I'm invested in that article and I'm trying to basically link that article to my reputation and my values. And if I don't do it consistently, if I'm not as good as what I say I am, it's going to become apparent. So I'm being forced by circumstances to be that good in the way I behave. And that's exactly what's happening with businesses right across the web right now, because of semantic search, because of the necessity for quality in everything. And because of the necessity for quality in everything, it also comes down to you can't fake it anymore. You can't create X marketing personas because the effort required to make them as good is really too much for one person, and you might as well have real people doing it. So suddenly we get in a very real kind of relationship building web where we build bridges across people and entities and businesses the same way that we did offline. You get to experience them, you get to assess them, you get to weigh who they are, you get to perceive them, and then you get to trust them. And the moment you trust them, there is a connection which actually means a lot more than just a casual purchasing decision.
Absolutely. And I mean, Mark, I feel like you're coming onto the Stone Temple Consulting team is a direct result of this idea of semantic search and building your personal brand and really developing that quality of information around a certain keyword space and a certain, you built this context for what you do. Is that a fair assumption for me to make?
Well, yeah, I think it is because it's. I mean, if Eric Engel was here, Eric Engel is my boss, the CEO and founder of Stone Temple Consulting. He would tell you, that's initially why he hired me. I mean, he and I knew each other. We had there's again, the power of the real relationship. He knew I was a real person. He's seen what I had done. We had connected because of my content, because you could see that content and the social presence was being produced by a real person. He wanted to get to know that person because he saw a lot of affinities between what he was trying to do with Stone Temple Consulting and what I was talking about already in my content separately from that. So eventually it made sense to him. He said, I want to bring this in and increase. He's built this business on the power of his personal brand, his reputation out there. People know and love Eric. They trust him. They see him as an expert, and so they want to do business with Stone Temple Consulting. And by bringing me in, he just increased the audience for that. That associates my audience with that now. So, in some ways, I'm kind of different from what I was talking about because I wasn't raised up as it was within within Stone Temple, and I was hired in. But in my case, it was a natural fit. Eric and I knew each other. He knew that I was going to very quickly become, it wasn't going to be a big change for me to be identified with the way Stone Temple does things.
And if I could add,
go ahead.
I was going to say, if I could add something to that.
Please do.
I was going to say, you know, Mark's case, and I happen to be sort of watched the whole thing happen, which is amazing. If we think how it would happen traditionally in a non-semantic web, you know, Stone Temple Consulting had a position. They would hire somebody based on some sort of qualifications. They would give them a job description. They would send them out to do the job. And who they hired would have been neither here nor there. But in a semantic web, this is no longer the case. The hire which you make is actually as important as the values and the value set of your company, which is exactly what happened here. And Mark was hired because a lot of his views were reflective of the internal values of Stone Temple Consulting, and also the way his profile worked in terms of how he operated was very much resonant with what the company was doing. So it was a case of perfect fit, which, you know, wouldn't have happened in the past.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant what David just said. I think that's going to be a hiring criteria in the future. Not for everybody, not for every job, obviously, but for more and more positions for companies that are trying to develop themselves, especially as companies are becoming more social companies where they are actually encouraging. We're seeing a number of brands having the courage to do this, to encourage their people to be active online on behalf of the company, even if they're not producing the main content, or they're not the blogger, they're not the conference speaker. Just in their normal Twitter accounts, their normal Google Plus accounts, to be openly saying, like, hey, I'm a part of this brand. If you want to know something, ask me. So with that in mind, I think more and more that will come into play as a part of the actual hiring processes. What is the personal brand of this person online? What's the reputation that they've built? What's the, is that a fit with our brand? And is the way that they even behave and they act and they talk online a fit with our brand's personality? It's going to be an interesting thing as we see this develop.
Absolutely. And I mean, it brings up, we're not going to talk about this, so I hope an audience member asks a question about this, but it does bring up the risk factor that Mark mentioned in his article. But before we get into that, I only have 3 more minutes for my questions. So my final question is, okay, you guys have convinced me. I want to be a truly social brand, and I have the right person in mind to be my personal brand. So what is my first move? And I'm going to start with Mark, because Mark mentions towards the bottom of his article that, when you have a person that's going to be a personal brand, you have to give them creative space, and you also have to allow them the time to be that personal brand. But what's my first move, Mark?
Yeah, I think that, this will be probably the more normal situation for most brands. I was saying mine is a little atypical in that, I kind of existed. Eric and I connected. We said, it's a marriage. And David was sort of the officiating priest. And this is getting too weird. But that's not going to be typical. More typical, and what I'm, want to be working with brands and clients of Stone Temple on is that this is something that you need to be developing and encouraging from within. I think that brand managers, that the C-suite needs to be paying attention to, who has this ability, who has this. There are certain qualities that I lay out in the bottom of the article. Some of them are probably innate. Some of them can be taught. Some of the more innate ones are, basically just likability. Is this a person who is able to connect with people? Do they have communication skills that they're able to be understood well, especially in brief media like Twitter or in a 2-minute video? Those kinds of things, the basic abilities, be looking for the people who have that, but also the people who are invested in your brand, who love what they're doing, who are thinking about it, talking about it when they're at cocktail parties, when they're out socially. Those are the kind of people you want to be developing them and encouraging and nurturing them toward being able to be that PBR, that personal brand representative that I talked about. So I think this is a new area. Again, I'm kind of inventing new jobs here, but I think it's going to be an area where people are going to be looking at actually making a human resources investment and saying, we've got to develop training programs for this, we've got to develop protocols for this. I'm very excited because that's part of what I want to be doing in the years to come, is helping the brands that we work with to do that very thing.
All right, and David, what would be your recommendation for first move?
Well, everything Mark described comes down to one thing: trust. because you can be really prescriptive internally and write out a very detailed job description, a very detailed actionable day for somebody. And if ultimately you don't trust them to make the right choices, to do the right thing, then you have a world of problems to actually deal with. And again, I've seen that firsthand in companies that try to move too fast, too quickly, without developing the culture of trust internally. And trust, whether you sort of develop it internally or externally within your organization or in the contact outside, always follows the 4 steps of contact, perception, assessment, and connection. And basically, there's no getting away from that. You need to be detailed in what you do. You need to be very clear. You need to be able to allow people to weigh what you do and how you do it. So you have to be very transparent. And then you have to be responsive. You have to actually be able to build bridges, which is where, again, the skill set that Mark mentioned comes in. And some of it can be taught, some of it needs to be within the person, but always, in order for it to work, there has to be that human connection, and there has to be that element of trust within that contact for it to happen.
I like it. I love it. I mean, as a relatively young person, I appreciate your attempts to create new jobs, guys. My generation thanks you for it. But that is the grounding portion of this event, and we are going to move into the lovely Kristen Drysdale helping us bring up any audience questions or interesting comments that are going on out there. So Kristen, what do you got for us? I see a comment. Okay, so we have Ronnie, who is doing an event with these 2 awesome dudes on December 18th, so please tune into that after this one. Ronnie says, how do businesses get over the fear factor of letting employees post on behalf of the brand? What if they leave? What if they say something wrong? Thank you, Ronnie, for asking the risk question that I was pointing to. So Mark mentioned this a little bit in his article, so why don't we go to Mark first. Mark, how do you get over the fear factor?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is running a business is a risk at a fundamental level. I always wonder when I hear this kind of question. It's like I usually get it from a business owner, and I'll say to them, like, so there's no risk in your business whatsoever. There was no risk in starting the business, in getting funders, and raising capital. There was no risk in trying out different marketing messages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they get the picture pretty quickly. Now that could be just a cop-out, but I understand what they're saying, because there's the added risk here of you're setting up someone, a human being, to be out there. Human beings are spontaneous, they're unpredictable sometimes, so it all comes down to, again, as David and I have been talking about so many times for the last half hour, to that trust factor. This is why I say I don't think this is ultimately something you can outsource. It's got to be somebody you develop from within, or that you have such a relationship with that you trust them, and that you have enough of a relationship with them that if they do blow it in some way, you're going to be able to recover from that, both in your own relationship together and in how you handle that publicly, and you go out there. We don't have time to get into all the things. There's a lot that can be said about how, because we've all seen the examples of huge snafus by brands online, with or without. A brand doesn't need a personal representative to make a huge snafu online, but it's how you recover from that. So that's one factor. The other is what if they leave? What if they move on? I think there's a lot that can be said about that. Part of it is, employees move on. They do. What if you hire somebody to a very important position that's not this in your brand? They're doing a lot of very important things to you. They have great client relationships, and they move on. That's just got to be part of the equation. And if your relationship is a good one, then it should continue to reflect well, even if they leave. I think, again, I just put myself as an example of that. I started building this personal brand that I have, whatever it is, for another agency other than Stone Temple, who I worked for 5 years. And I left them, obviously, but my content is still back there, as it has my name on it, as my reputation continues to grow, if people find that content and they know me, they say like, oh, look at all this stuff by Mark Traphagen that's associated with this other company. That's good for them, and they've understood that. They just a very quick example here of that. When I wrote the first article about this, which is more about Google authorship back in January, I said companies should be using Google authorship, real Google authors. I brought this up, and I brought this example up, but I didn't name my former agency because I didn't want to embarrass them. But one of the chief executives of that agency came in the comments and said, "I'll name us. We're it. We're the ones Mark left, and we are proud. This worked for us. And even though we hated him leaving, and we would have rather had him stay, his reputation still reflects back on us, and this really does work." So there's a lot more that could be said about that, but that's just a couple of things that I would put out there about those fears.
Absolutely. David, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, how can organizations deal with this fear factor?
Well, everything Mark said in his personal example and everything the question itself reflects comes down to control. And business by design is great at creating a sense of control, which then gives it a sense of security, which then gives it a sense of risk mitigation, which is a total illusion, really, because most of the times there is no real control in the things that matter, and there's a lot of control in the things which don't matter, like the lives of their employees and the hours they spend and everything they do within the company in a very dictatorial way. So essentially, in order for businesses to move forward in a 21st century environment, they really have to humanize the connection. And it's exactly the case with Mark in his particular example. He worked for another company, he left. The relationship still stayed strong in terms of mutual respect, even though they didn't want him to leave. But no business has a right to think that the people who work for it are owned by it. Eventually, some of them will leave, some will stay. It'll be their own decision. It's up to the business to make the environment they work in absolutely great for them to stay. And incidentally, this is one of the messages which Eric Smith's book, How Google Works, has. And so, within Google, they hate to see people leaving. They try very hard to make them stay. And they know that in 95% of the times, it's not the money which makes them go, but the conditions, the working conditions, and the sense of achievement and self-esteem that they develop doing what they want. And this is a very strong message, I think, in the way that businesses develop in this kind of context, in this very new way of working where the relationships that you form with your employees can actually become beneficial to you in the future.
Absolutely. And if anyone is really interested in this topic, someone that does talk about this a lot is Gideon Rosen. He talks about the DDO, the Deliberately Developmental Organization, and it's an organization that develops people. That's the goal of the organization, is to develop the people that work for that organization. And he goes into depth about this fear factor and how it's not really a warranted fear factor. So I'm just going to throw his name out there. If you guys are interested in this topic, he likes to talk about it. All right, Kristen, next question. This is exciting for me because I don't even see these before they come up. Okay, so we have Marilyn More. Does the importance of being personal create an advantage for small business? If so, thank you so much, Marilyn, for bringing this question up. If so, do you have recommendations of how that can be leveraged? And we'll start with David this time.
Okay, that's a loaded question, and let's unpack it. But the short answer to that is yes. But let's see why it is loaded in the first place. Well, theoretically, a small business is ideally placed to become more personal and personable on the web because it has a smaller team, it is more agile. Now, what it doesn't have is what a big business actually does, which is a process which makes it consistent. So sometimes we see small businesses being personal and personable on the web. They get an audience, they start to identify with it, and then they stop because other things come into their horizon. They haven't got the manpower or the willpower, and they prioritize those things because they absolutely have to, and they let other things drop. So this kind of inconsistency creates a sense with their audience of perhaps, they don't really matter. The business is only marketing to them. It's not a real relationship in the sense that they're real people. And the moment you're being treated that way, or you feel you're being treated that way, then you tend to take your attention elsewhere, and it's very much an attention economy we're in. So really, a small business can certainly benefit, but in order to leverage this adequately, it has to create an internal process and stick to it. And here they have to be realistic. What is manageable for them? They may like, for instance, to be on Twitter, for 4 hours a day, and they simply can't do it. So they have to make do for half an hour. They may like to be on Google Plus with 20 posts a day, and they can only make perhaps one every 2 days. It doesn't matter in the long term as long as they're consistent, and that's what they really need to focus on.
Okay, I'm ready. I'm ready for Mark to jump in on this, because there is a part of your article that kind of deals with this idea. I mean, you don't necessarily mention small brands versus large brands, but it is a big question, because a lot of small brands are saying, well, the big brands have an upper hand. They have a bunch of people and a bunch of resources to
yeah. I think David's answer to that was excellent in terms of that. Everybody, believe me, we work with big brands, and everybody thinks, oh, they have all this money, they have all these resources, they have all this money, they can do anything. But what people don't realize is that they have those things, but they too often trip over themselves. They can't even use them because they're so big. They have so many departments, and things are siloed, and there's politics. A lot of that a small business doesn't necessarily have to deal with. It's more like a family. You can get things done more quickly. So I think the first part is, what David said is so important. You've got to develop process, and that's where you mimic the big brands, but then take advantage of the advantage that you have. And especially if you're the owner of the small business, who's going to be more passionate about that small business than the person who invested their life savings in it, whose entire future depends on this thing succeeding or failing. I always go back to this one example, and I'll give it really quickly because I think it's such a good one. Because I used to think it was a great content marketing example, but now I think it's an even better example of what I'm talking about here, of a PBR from a small business. When I was a kid growing up in New Jersey, there was this guy who had a local, garden shop. There were lots of garden shops around, right? Greenhouse kind of thing. Lots of them in the area at that time. But he got on a local radio station and did a program every Saturday. It was a call-in show. People could call in with their questions about, I've got aphids on my daffodils. What do I do? All those kinds of gardening questions that people have. And not only did he present himself as a credible expert on that because he could give them the answers, but his passion for gardening, his personality, his love for it came across in that program so strongly that people wanted to go to that place. They wanted to meet him. They wanted to go and be part of that business, and his garden shop business just took off. It went through the roof, largely on the back of that. And I realize now that it wasn't just the great content, it wasn't just the expertise, as important as those are. There has to be some there, as I'm always saying, but it was the strength of who he was as a person that people connected with. So I think that's where a small business could have that advantage of coming across with the sincerity, the passion, the real interest that people will connect with.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm so glad that question came up, because I know that it's something that a lot of small brands and large brands are definitely thinking about. So thank you again, Marilyn. Such a great question. All right, next one. Can fit in a couple more. See? Maybe? Kristen, do we have another question?
There's conversation going on around empathy, and I'm trying to pick out one specific one to pull up. It's like lots of broken parts to it.
Maybe you could summarize, Kristen?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, okay, here we go. Marilyn is asking, should empathy be a factor in creating a more personalized experience? And she also mentions that in relation to user experience with websites as well.
Love it. Okay, so how does empathy factor into this? And David has written a couple of Sunday reads about empathy. So, David, we'll start with you.
Well, I love this question because it's something which is very difficult to quantify, and it's absolutely crucial when it comes to success in a social media setting. Now, ultimately, a lot of the things that I do, a lot of the things that Mark does, is we take a lot of the soft qualities of the human condition, trust and identity and relationship building, and we break them down into modules, if you like, which then can be acquired and processed and put in place in order to create that kind of effect. And ultimately you ask, well, is this the ultimate artifice? Doesn't this go against everything we're talking about? Instead of keeping it real, we're actually keeping it more artificial, just making it look real. And the answer to that always is that you can't really fake being real. You have to have, and this is where the empathy factor comes in. We're very good as people to actually connect to somebody at a very human level. The moment there's no empathy, there is no real human connection. Everything becomes part of a transactional value where somebody gains something, somebody gives something. And when things go wrong, then you have a crisis. A lot of the social media crisis we see at corporate level is because of that. They're not really because a brand has done something really wrong, but it's done something really wrong and then ignored it, and then ignored the fact that it ignored it, and then tried to cover up, and then it became a whole thing of how does it deal with people when something goes wrong, i.e. it doesn't see them like people at all. And that is a crisis which has an impact on brand equity and brand value in the company. And it happens time and time again. And the solution always is empathy. The moment, things will go wrong. Mark said that, you can't really, in a social media environment, you can't really have people who will be perfect in everything the company does. It just doesn't happen. But you will have people who will connect with people, and we accept that the moment things go wrong, we're going to try really hard to set it right. And yeah, we made a mistake, but we're just people working under pressure. If that isn't there, if that empathy factor isn't there, everything changes. And a lot of the crises we see are because of that. So this is a long way of answering Marilyn's question of where is empathy necessary. It is absolutely critical. It is absolutely important. And this is where the magic happens of that human relationship, where you realize that the person behind the screen, the person behind the email, the person behind the marketing message is actually a human being. And they're trying to help you achieve the same things you want to achieve. And this is exactly the point where goal alignment has to come into play. Where when you're buying something from somebody, or when you're getting some piece of information, they're actually committed to helping you achieve a smooth transaction and solve a problem, as opposed to them just making a quick buck or getting a click on something.
And I think the empathy also enters into, we're understanding more and more in marketing about how much what happens in anything that ends up in a transaction, whether that's getting a client, whether it's somebody buying a product, it's somebody filling out a lead card, whatever it is that your goal is to have happen, is a journey. It doesn't happen in an instant in most cases. There's a trip that the potential customer goes on, and there's a journey that the brand goes on. And where empathy happens along that journey is when, in the drama of somebody's journey, they reach a pain point. And it's like, I've got a problem. I need to solve something. I need to be able to do this better. I need, whether it's getting the ring around the collar out of my shirts, or it's solving my company's SEO problems, whatever it is, that's a pain point. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, I've got a story just like that. I was where you were, and I reached that point too. I had ring around the collar, and my company couldn't show up online. And then, one day we figured out how to do this, and I can help you with that. That's where the empathy comes across. That's where the connection can be made in the journey. Like, I'm more willing to listen to a real person who can tell me, I've been there, I've done that, I know, man, I know what you're talking about. But I've seen the other side. I can get you past that. Now we've made that empathetic connection that becomes real, that becomes human, that becomes beyond just features and benefits, and moves somebody into action.
So I think this question is important because both of your articles talked about trust. You both mentioned trust, and I keep thinking about, Mark, in your article you have EAT, right? Expertise, authority, and trustworthiness. And I mean, my question is, and I don't, maybe I'll start with Mark here, and it's still sticking with empathy. Is empathy necessary in the trust process?
I think it is, and I think that's where the trust comes from, right? That it's when we feel a connection. You can't trust somebody or anything with which you have no connection. Seeing a random billboard on the side of the road, it might work for, might meet an immediate need, or it might get a name in your brand, but it doesn't it doesn't empathize with you. It doesn't connect in that way, that human basic way that says, I'm going to be moved to actually do something on the basis of this, to take action on it. So yeah, I think it's you know, I don't have much to add to that except that I think it's very much wrapped up in it.
And David, I feel like I know your answer, but would you agree?
Well, I definitely would, and I'll give an example I frequently bring up with corporate clients. And I say, you know, if you have a meeting with somebody and you agree everything on the meeting, and there's a 100-page document you need to agree, and that person agrees every single page of that. They sign it, they countersign it, it's brilliant, they've agreed every point. And you get up to leave, and you put out your hand to shake their hand, and they don't do that. Would you trust them? And they say no, even though legally, the evidence we have in front of us says that, you know, they agreed on everything. Because there's a lack of that human connection, if anything, you know, the immediate response of that is that there's no contact, no connection being made at a human level. Then immediately your trust levels go down. And that quantifies, I think, exactly everything Mark said and a lot of the comments on the stream.
Absolutely. And we have another question from Ronnie Benser, which works fantastically with this. How can keeping traditional representation of a brand exist at the same time that a personal representation phases in? What about perceived conflict? So we're going back to the idea of brand identity, which it does incorporate this idea of trust. How do you transition from, how do you maintain your brand identity but transition into incorporating personal brands? And we'll start with Mark.
Well, that is such an excellent question, because it allows, for one thing, it allows me to clarify something. And some people may be mistaken thinking like that I'm saying like, this is the new thing, just do this, don't do anything else. Not saying that at all. You know, even as you start to develop personal brand representatives, you still have to pay attention to other things, and including your overall brand representation and your brand image. That doesn't go away. That doesn't become a non-thing at that point. So when Ronnie says here, you know, how do I transition, or how do you transition that? You know, we don't want to give the idea that you're going to stop paying attention to your corporate brand once you have this in place. So I think it's more of a parallel motion, and that it develops naturally out of it. If it's going to be real, you know, we keep talking again about authentic and real and trustworthy, it's going to be those things, then there should not be any conflict. That's again why I've emphasized, like, this needs to come from somebody within your organization, or somebody with whom that you so trust and you so know that you can bring them in and know they're going to fit, because they've got to be able to actually represent what the brand is about. If people start to see, you know, the brand seems to be saying one thing and this representative saying another thing, that would be bad. So, you know, yeah.
That's true. I would hope, I mean, maybe this is just me, but I would hope if conflicts do arise, you maybe discuss them internally before they are discussed externally with your audience. I
think a part of that is that if you're going to trust this with somebody, part of the process that you set up should be that you are regularly talking. You know, if you're the business owner, let's say, or you're the part of the C-suite, you're regularly meeting and talking with that person and making sure that you're on the same page, and that you know where things are going, and that you know what the message is, for their benefit as well as yours.
Which is such a great, I want to move to David with this question, but it's such a great thing to bring up, that a lot of the discussion that we're talking about right now has to do with communication from a brand to an audience. But one of the key components to this, I think, is internal communication, which a lot of organizations still struggle with today, I think. But David, how do you see this transition working? Do you see conflicts arising with this transition from traditional methods to incorporating the personal brand?
Inevitably, yes. And everything Mark said is on point pretty much, because essentially you do have to create an alignment of goals between the individual and the company. But he mentioned communication, as you did, Alex, and communication is really key. let's not forget that the reason we had the disconnect between traditional marketing and what we expect today is not because companies changed, because we did. Companies used to market to us in a very compartmentalized, siloed way because we were all living in little boxes and never communicated with each other, and we just had to receive our awareness of information and product knowledge through a top-down approach, through approved, dedicated channels. And now we don't do that. We look for reputational values across the social web, we check with each other, we're interconnected, and information flows bilaterally across us, across our networks, and we do our own due diligence. And we have developed our own trust points and people we go to and websites we check. And this transition hasn't really been mirrored very adequately within the organization itself, which is why it creates so many problems. So essentially, a company, in order to communicate with us effectively, or even a brand or even a small business, has to mirror the same process. It has to, at the interface with its customers, be very social, very open, very transparent, to create a sense of trust and awareness. But then it has to also do that internally. And if it doesn't do that internally, then it's going to trip up, because obviously there's a disconnect there and a lot of conflicts which are being hidden and they will surface at some point. And that's where you get all of the problems occurring. Communication is absolutely key. It's key within semantic web, it's key within semantic search, because essentially you're communicating identity and brand values and concepts which make you stand out from the crowd. But it's also key to fostering the kind of culture which makes everything move forward in a much smoother way, in a much more trusting way perhaps, and certainly it increases the cooperation factor within the organization, which most organizations still struggle with.
And no, guys, I didn't write that answer for him. If you think that I was just trying to make communication the key component of this, it wasn't me, I swear. I swear it wasn't me. But it's so true. It's so true. Okay, we have 3 more minutes. So I would like to end this conversation with, because this is a question that it's personally difficult for me. I see it from a communication standpoint, and I see a lot of people struggle with this idea of the entire concept of this was keeping it real, right? Being authentic, being who you are, what your brand stands for. But a lot of what goes into your articles had to do with strategy too. So how do you balance the idea of keeping it real while still having a communication and social media strategy? And I'm going to start with Mark, because his had a bit more strategy mentioned than David's.
Yeah, that's a great question, because, again, just like with the previous one, people might get some kind of idea that the two things are antithetical, and they aren't at all. You know, you can be natural and plan to be natural. That sounds, you know, it sounds like it doesn't go together, but you know, you have to. When you meet somebody who moves into a social situation, whether it's at a party or a networking event, and you know they seem like they just communicate so well, and they empathize so well, and they draw people into the conversation. They make people feel important. They move the conversation along. You'd be tempted to think they're just a natural, and maybe to some extent they are. But I'll bet you that that person has practiced that they've worked at it, that they've thought intentionally about it. I can think of that in terms of myself developing as a speaker, doing more and more public speaking. And now when I go to a conference, I always joke that I have one ear and one eye on the content, whatever I can learn from the speaker saying. But my other ear and my other eye is very much focused on how they're saying it, how they develop their slides, how they, at what points do they have the audience, where do they lose the audience. So I am training and teaching myself to be a better, more natural speaker. So without getting into any more detail than that, saying I don't think the two are antithetical. I think that if your strategy is to be authentic and you look at what makes that happen, you will realize that you can't do it by faking it. And so the strategy will meld with the authenticity in the people that you work it through.
Good answer. Man, okay, David?
Well, I love this because I usually give a real-world example here. And I say, you leave your house in the morning to get to work, and you're running a little bit late, so you haven't had coffee. And as you get out, the next door neighbor says, "Hi, good morning, how's it going?" And you want to get to your car, so you want to tell him, "Stop talking to me, I'm in a hurry." And it needs to be de-iced, so you want to scream at the sky, and the moment you hit traffic on the road, which makes you even later at work, you want to sort of, rail at everybody in front of you. And none of us do that. We don't. You're going to stop and smile at your neighbor and say, "Hey, heck of a day, and I'm running late." And you're going to get to your car and de-ice it first. And then, if you're stuck on the road, you're stuck on the road. You can't do anything about that. So you're going to basically put on the stereo, put on some music, and just wait until the traffic gets you to where you want to be. And the point of all this is that we have strategies, coping strategies of working out our lives in the real world without actually becoming artificial. And it allows us to surface the better parts of us, whereas perhaps the most genuine thing would have been really obnoxious and antithetical to smooth day. And this is exactly the point of creating strategies for the online world. It's not so much to massage the message or create a very perfect picture, but it's in order to allow the better connecting elements of the human condition to actually create a contact. And that's what strategies are designed to do. And we have to give them a name, so they have to be strategies, and they have to be things which are modular and people can understand, simply because it's online and it's new. Whereas in the offline world, we do all these things instinctively without much thinking about them. And the reason we do that is for the same reason we do them in the online world. We don't yell at our neighbor because we have to face him again the next day, and our reputation matters to us. And having a smooth relationship with him, it's actually good for everybody in the neighborhood. We don't yell at the traffic on the road because it's the kind of thing crazy people do, and it doesn't really work out very well for you. So really, these are the things which we have developed instinctive strategies for coping with, and we don't really think about it. In the online world, we do. We need to compartmentalize things, break them down, try to understand them better, and try to behave in better ways, simply because it's too new an environment, and the traditional checks and balances which should be there really aren't, and we have to create them. So there's your answer.
Again, I could talk about self-presentation, but we're not going to go there today. All right. Thank you both so much, David Amerland, Mark Traphagen. This has been such a fantastic hour for me, and I don't want to speak for the audience, but I'm going to. I think the audience enjoyed it as well. So before we move on, David, where is the best place for people to continue to have conversations with you?
I'm in G+, a lot more than I should be maybe, but I'm addicted. And you can find me on my website at davidamerland.com.
Fantastic. And Mark, where's the best place for people to continue conversing with you?
Google+, obviously, and Twitter as well. And people can just Google me. On the whole first page of Google for my name, they'll find me.
That makes me think of an old post that David Amerland put out, why he doesn't use business cards. He just says, just Google it, just Google me. And of course, I want to thank Kristen Drysdale. Thank you so much for dealing with the comments for me and the questions. I did hear that there were a couple of other great questions to pull up. We ran out of time, so we'll definitely jump into Ronnie. I know if you want to snag some of those questions for your half hour with these guys, you're totally welcome to do it. And of course, last but never least, I want to thank John Ellis for producing this as SEOWiSE. He's always the man behind the scenes. He doesn't get the camera time. He says I'm prettier, but I don't know. I think it's subjective. But again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And John, take us out.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this SEOWiSE special event. This is an engagement broadcast, so keep engaging. The conversation doesn't stop here. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care.